Hello and welcome to Tragedies at Sea. I'm Mickey Hansen. What you just saw earlier was a show done called The Monitor in the Merrimac, and that's what today's show is going to be about. Today I have with me a guest, Dr. Jerry Oripovich, a person with the Lincoln Museum. Would you mind telling the people about the museum?
Well, the Lincoln Museum here in Fort Wayne is the world's largest museum dedicated to Abraham Lincoln. It has existed in some form since 1928, when it was founded by the Lincoln National Life Insurance Company, which was named for Abraham Lincoln. The company wanted to thank the Lincoln family for use of the name and began collecting Lincoln materials. That collection has grown over the years to the museum that we have today, this world-class museum here in Fort Wayne, and I'm the historian. I help direct programming and work with the exhibits there.
Oh, okay. Now, I think the first question I should ask is, what was the significance of Ironclads in the Civil War?
Well, the Monitor and the Merrimac that you mentioned, the battle between those two ships represents the first battle between two ironclad ships. Before the Civil War, navies were made overwhelmingly of ships made of wood, entirely of wood. With the 1850s, the decade before the Civil War, navies of the world started experimenting with ironclad ships, putting a skin of iron over a wooden ship to give it more protection in battle. The advantage of ironcladding, of course, brings more protection. Wooden ships are much more vulnerable to burning. They're easier to destroy. When the Civil War began, the South had no navy whatsoever, and the North had a very small navy. So both sides frantically tried to build new ships that would give them some kind of naval advantage. The South built what they called the CSS Virginia on the hull of the old Union ship Merrimac, which they captured at the beginning of the war. They built it on a traditional hull. They built an iron casemate on top. The Union built the Monitor from scratch as a ship to fight against the Merrimac, and those were the first two ironclad ships that came into combat.
What can you tell us about the Monitor?
Well, when the word came to the federal government that the Confederates had captured the hull of the old Merrimac, the old frigate Merrimac, and were building it into an ironclad ship, we're building basically an iron house on top of the deck, there was consternation, almost panic in Washington, because there was a fear that this new ironclad ship could just sail up the Potomac River, bombard the White House, and it would be impervious to anything that the Federal Navy could do about it with its old wooden ships. So the Navy frantically began seeking some kind of new ship that could stop the Merrimac. They had a competition, designs were brought in. They selected a couple of them. One was a ship that was a traditional sailing ship, but with iron sides. It was eventually built and named the New Ironsides. They settled on another design that was eventually named the Galena after Grant's hometown. But neither of these was possibly going to be built in time to stop the Merrimac from sailing up the river from its home in Virginia and attacking Washington. So more or less at the last moment, they came upon the Swedish inventor John Ericsson, who had years ago designed a radical new ship. And they put out a contract to Ericsson to build this new ship within 90 days, a remarkably short time to build any kind of vessel. This vessel was Ericsson's Monitor. It was totally different from any other fighting vessel of the 19th century to that point. It did not have a long gun deck with rows of cannon. It had a single turret with 2 cannon. It was very low to the water. It was fully armored. It had an iron turret. It had iron skirt hanging over the sides, going under the water to protect it from shells that would go through the water line. And by frantic effort, they got the ship built within the 90 days, sailed it down to Virginia, and got there just as the Merrimac was emerging to do its first battle.
So, what was the Merrimac doing?
Well, the Merrimac was part of the Confederate forces in Virginia near the end of the Chesapeake Bay, where Norfolk, Virginia is. The Union was blockading the South. Right at the start of the war, President Lincoln had declared a blockade. The blockade was a legal maneuver that said no ships could come in or out of the South, and it was designed to starve the South economically, prevent it from using its cotton as a diplomatic tool to sell abroad, to buy weapons and medicines, and to gain diplomatic recognition. With the blockade, the South was cut off from the rest of the world. So Southern ships could not go in or out of the Virginia ports. The purpose of the Merrimac was to sail out, destroy the Federal ships that were blockading the port, and open the port to Southern commerce. In early 1862, the Merrimac sailed down the James River and out into the Chesapeake Bay toward the Federal blockading squadron and began attacking these Union ships. And that was the beginning of what would become the battle between the Merrimac and the Monitor.
Have you read too much about what was involved with manning these ships?
Well, it was both ships were unique vessels, so it was difficult to find crews. The South, in particular, had a hard time finding crews for any of their ships. They did not have as large a naval population as the North. But for the Monitor, it was also difficult to find a crew because this was such an unusual vessel. It had no sails, for example. The Navy contract to build the Monitor called for a full set of rigging. There was supposed to be an elaborate set of masts and sails built on the Monitor so it could sail under wind power as well as steam. The Navy put that in all their contracts, so they put that in the Monitor contract, but you know what the Monitor looks like, the flat deck with a round turret. There's no place to put sails on it. Erickson just ignored that part of the contract. This was such an unusual vessel that no one knew how to sail it or what kind of crew members you needed.
I heard some critics thought when it was launched it was going to sink right then and there.
Absolutely. There was much concern about the stability of the Monitor. Erickson himself had submitted designs to the Navy in the past that had been challenged on the grounds of their stability. He had an unfortunate incident in the 1840s where he had designed a new cannon. Another fellow, I think named Stockton, had also designed a new cannon. These were installed on a ship called the Princeton, and at a test firing of the cannon, Stockton's cannon was tested. He had not built it as properly as Erickson had done his. Stockton's gun blew up. It killed a cabinet officer, a state senator from New York, whose daughter went on to marry President Tyler after that incident. It was a devastating political fiasco for this gun to blow up and kill all these politicians. And Erickson, although his gun didn't blow up, was associated with the blame for that, and the Navy considered him suspect. So when he came up with this plan for this radical new design, there was much concern that this man who was seen as a crazy foreign inventor had come up with a design that would not be stable. Now, there was some justification to this, because when the Monitor sailed from the north down to Hampton Roads to fight the Merrimac, it proved a very barely seaworthy ship. It barely made it down the coast. It took a couple days to sail, and it was so low to the water, had barely a foot of freeboard, that the waves would wash over the deck, go down into the air intakes, and threaten to put out the boiler fires. The pump that was supposed to supply fresh air to the ship failed under the water coming in, and the ship began filling up with the poisonous gases from the engine. It was a very dangerous trip. It was not a ship anybody would want to sail on.
Well, was the Merrimac much better in terms of seaworthiness?
No, the Merrimac was not a very good ocean-going vessel, certainly. It was not intended really to be one. When they built an iron casemate on top of this wooden hull, this was much more weight than the designers of the original Merrimac hull had ever intended to put on it. So it rode quite low in the water. It did not have good ventilation. The engines did not run well. The hull of the Merrimac, which I said had been captured from the Union Navy, was in fact captured underwater. At the very beginning of the war, the Union burned Norfolk Navy Yard and abandoned it, and burned all the ships there, including the Merrimac. So when the Confederates moved into Norfolk, they raised the hull from underwater, and it had the engines in it. So they had been underwater for several months, and they were not in good condition. So the Merrimac was a very unhandy, awkward vessel, uncomfortable for the crew. It took 30 minutes for the Merrimac to turn 180 degrees. It was a very unmaneuverable ship. Neither of these ships went faster than 9 knots, maybe.
Is there any way you can talk about the battle itself?
Sure. What happened when the Merrimac came out to fight was that it attacked the Union blockading squadron, the wood vessels that were there. The USS Congress, who else was out there? The USS Cumberland were 2 wooden vessels, 2 of the best frigates in the Federal Navy, and the Merrimac just sailed up and fired at them with impunity. These 2 sailing ships fired back, and their cannonballs just bounced off the Merrimac. While the Merrimac set these ships on fire, it fired red-hot shot where they would take the cannonballs, heat them in the ship's fires, and then shoot them, so that when they hit the wooden ship, they would eventually set it on fire. The Merrimac rammed one of these ships as well. I've forgotten which one. It had a wooden ram built, or an iron ram rather, built onto the bow so it could sail and knock a hole in an enemy ship. So it destroyed, or put out of action the Congress and the Cumberland, and started to do the same thing to the USS Minnesota, another modern frigate, wooden frigate. The Minnesota was far enough away and in shallow enough water that the Merrimac couldn't approach it. So it did some damage and then went back to its port, figuring it would come back the next day, finish off the Minnesota, finish off any other remaining Federal vessels, and declare the port open, declare the blockade at an end, perhaps cause France and Britain to recognize the Confederacy as an independent country now that the blockade would be lifted. At the end of that first day's battle, it looked like the Southern Confederacy was very close to a complete victory.
Now, in your opinion, who had the advantage, the Monitor or the Merrimac?
Well, that's what was discovered on the next day when the Monitor arrived. It was just, again, one of the most amazing coincidences that 90 days after having the contract issued to build this ship, through frantic efforts to build it, to sail it down the coast, it arrived that night after the Merrimac's first sortie into Hampton Roads. So the Monitor sailed out into the bay, and the next day when Merrimac came out to finish off the Minnesota, there was this thing. The Merrimac's crew looked out, and there was this flat object with a big round thing on top. They had no idea what it was. It certainly didn't look like a ship. It was much smaller than any of the conventional frigates. It was about half as long as, say, the Minnesota or the Cumberland. On board the Merrimac, some of the crew members thought it was literally a raft bringing a new boiler out to the Minnesota for its engines. They didn't know what this thing was. So they sailed toward the Minnesota, the Merrimac did, intending to finish it off. And this weird thing started moving toward them and got between them and the Minnesota. And when it opened one of the 2 portholes in the round turret and ran an 11-inch smoothbore cannon out and opened fire, they realized this was a Yankee ship. So the 2 of them started shooting at each other. They fought for several hours. Both sides scored direct hits. The Monitor had 2 11-inch guns and was able to open the porthole, run the gun out, fire it, bring it back in, reload, and continue this, while the Merrimac, meanwhile, had a broadside of several guns on each side and was firing those in succession at the Monitor. Both sides hit each other, but they discovered they couldn't do any significant damage. The cannonballs just clanged off. It made a terrible noise if you were inside the Monitor's turret when an enormous iron cannonball hit. The concussion was violent, but it didn't kill anybody. It didn't put the ship out of action. The same thing was true on the Merrimac. It was an unpleasant place to be. It was filled with powder smoke from the cannon. The sound of the gun, of the Monitor's cannonballs rattling off the armor outside was very unpleasant. The wooden planking behind the iron face was in some cases splintered by these cannonballs, by the concussion. But neither one could damage the other. So they fought for several hours. They fired back and forth.
Now, in your opinion, who won, the Monitor or the Merrimac?
That's a very good question. The battle ended when both sides realized they weren't doing much harm. The Merrimac at one point tried to ram the Monitor, figuring it could use its ram. Actually, it had left its ram in the side of one of the Federal ships when it rammed it the day before, and pulled back away. The ram, the metal part of the ram broke off. But it still had a wooden bow, and it was so much bigger and heavier than the Monitor that had the Merrimac hit it broadside, it just would have driven right over it and swamped the very low-riding Monitor. So the commander of the Merrimac, a fellow named Jones, tried to do this. But as I mentioned, it took half an hour to turn the Merrimac a full or a half circle. The Monitor was much more nimble and just easily avoided these ramming attempts. The Monitor realized that the Merrimac got close and sent some sailors over to board the ship. They could climb on the deck, stick a few spikes in to jam the Monitor's turret in position so it couldn't fire, and capture the ship easily. The Monitor was vulnerable to that, but the Merrimac was not nimble enough to get close. Well, finally, the Merrimac had a shot that hit the pilot house of the Monitor, and the pilot house was a small square structure in front of the turret where the commander of the ship stayed during the battle. The commander, John Warden, was looking out the view from this pilot house at the Merrimac when a cannonball hit right on the pilot house. It shook it apart. It knocked some of the iron plates off. It wounded Warden. He was temporarily blinded. His face was covered with blood. He looked in terrible shape, and he relinquished command to his second-in-command. The new commander had the ship pull away from the Merrimac so he could assess the damage, see how Warden was doing, see if the pilot house had been destroyed or not. So he pulled away just a few yards. The ships at one point were only 10 yards apart shooting at each other. He pulled away to assess the damage, and the Virginia, or the Merrimac, thought the Monitor was retreating, and they set up a cheer and believed they had won the battle. And they began to move towards their home. On the Monitor, the sailors saw the Virginia, or the Merrimac, starting to go back, and they thought that the Virginia was retreating, the Merrimac was retreating, so they set up a cheer and thought they had won the battle. And that brought the battle to an end. Both sides pulled away from each other. Neither side had suffered any fatalities in the battle. Both sides had had superficial damage, anything protruding like a smokestack or a lifeboat on the deck of the Merrimac got shot up, but the iron plates held on both ships. Neither one was destroyed. Neither one was put out of action. And when it was over, as a tactical matter, it was purely a draw. Neither side could damage the other. At one point, the Confederate gunner ordered the cannoneers to stop shooting. And the Confederate captain came down and said, "What do you mean by this? Why are the guns no longer firing?" And the Confederate gunner-in-chief said, "Well, our powder is precious, and I find I can do just as much damage by snapping my fingers at her every 2.5 minutes. In other words, he couldn't accomplish anything with the cannons. So both sides stopped firing, both sides went back to their respective bases, and that was the end of the battle. It was a draw in that sense.
Okay, if you have any questions for Jerry about not just the Monitor, but the Civil War in general, go ahead and call. The number is 422-3903. Again, 422-3903. Now, what was the fate of the Monitor and the Merrimac?
Well, after the battle, although it was seen as a...
we have a phone caller.
Okay.
Big show.
Okay.
I was just wondering, did they just have the one battle, and if so, why?
Did the Monitor and the Merrimac have only one battle? And
Yes.
Yes, in fact, they only fought that one time. After both sides went back to their own ports, there was no reason for either side to come out. The Monitor certainly couldn't go in and look for the Merrimac. Both sides stayed under cover of the land-based artillery that each side had in plenty. So the blockade was back in place, and there was no reason for the Monitor to come out and do anything. As long as it stayed at Hampton Roads, it was now once again enforcing the blockade. The Merrimac couldn't effectively come out, particularly after its base at Norfolk, Virginia, was abandoned by the Confederate Army. Once the Confederates left Norfolk, they blew up the Merrimac rather than let it fall into Yankee hands. So that was the end of the Merrimac. The Confederates blew it up because they lost their land base. The Monitor stayed there for another year. Eventually they decided to send it south down to South Carolina to join the blockading squadron down there. It was not a seaworthy ship. That was a mistake. And in a storm off Cape Hatteras, it sank.
How about discussing the Merrimac's and Monitor's predecessors?
Well, the predecessors, in terms of naval warfare up to that time, were the ships that you imagine Lord Nelson sailing, Horatio Hornblower sailing, and the Patrick, what's that fellow's name, Patrick O'Brien, is it? I've forgotten, the naval novelist. The great sailing ships, the old Ironside-style ships, were the main battle ships from the early 18th century right up to the Civil War. They were made of wood, they had long rows of guns, they'd carry anything up from 30 guns on a frigate up to 100 guns, 120 guns on the biggest man-of-war ships. What happened to make them obsolete was the invention of the shell gun. These traditional ships just fired cannonballs that would knock a hole in anything they hit, the big, heavy, shot-put-like object. Or at close range, they could fire grape shot, small cannonballs, basically, that would kill men, but not destroy the ship. With the invention of the shell, a hollow projectile filled with an explosive, you now had something that would explode over the enemy ship and usually set it on fire. In the 1850s, 1854, during the Crimean War, a Russian naval squadron with shell-firing guns attacked a Turkish squadron of wooden ships and in minutes set all the Turkish ships on fire. It clearly announced to all the navies of the world that wooden ships were now completely vulnerable to shell guns and were obsolete. So when the Civil War began, both sides, and not just the Union Confederacy, but France, Britain, Russia, all the naval powers of the world, were trying to figure out what the next generation of warships would look like, because the old, stately, tall-masted man-of-war was clearly obsolete. The wooden ship was obsolete. So that brought them to designing things like the Merrimac, like the Monitor, like other iron-plated ships that Britain and France were building at the same time.
What's President Lincoln's view of the Monitor?
Lincoln had a hand in the Monitor's story. He was called in with other officials to review the plans when Ericsson's ship was first proposed. As you recall, Washington was in a panic. What were they going to do with the Merrimac coming up the river and stopping them? They needed something that could be effective. Gideon Welles, the Secretary of the Navy, had convened various officials to look at these plans, and one of them, at one of these meetings, Lincoln was there. His comment, supposedly, when he was shown the plans of this odd, remarkable new thing, was to say that it reminded him of the Western girl putting her foot in a stocking. She said, "It strikes me there's something in it." Well, it struck Lincoln there was something in this plan. It seemed to make sense. So he supported the idea of the Monitor. He was not a naval, he had no naval experience whatsoever. He was not someone who could speak authoritatively on it. But he instinctively saw that there was something useful in what Ericsson had come up with.
I'm trying to figure out what else to say, but can you discuss a little bit about other ships of significance during the Civil War?
Sure. The battle between the Monitor and the Merrimac was the first battle of ironclads, where both sides had ironclad ships involved. It was not the only use of ironclads in the war by any means. Once the Merrimac had shown its effectiveness, the South tried to build as many ironclads as it could, using, again, captured hulls of Union ships or of any ships they could get hold of. Their problem in the South was they didn't have any iron to speak of. Other than the Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond, there were no major iron rolling facilities in the South. So they could not build ironclad ships. They didn't have the technology to do it. They didn't have the supplies. They used railroad iron. They would take up railroad rails, literally, and put them on the sides of ships. They built cotton-clad ships. They would put cotton bales piled along the decks of ships to provide some protection. So they had cotton-clads. They had these rail-clad ships. They had what they called tin-clads with very thin boiler iron that would not really keep out a cannonball. The Confederates, using very little resources, were remarkably successful in building up a number of ironclads, some of which had some success. On the Union side, you had far greater resources. You had all the great shipyards of New England and New York. And after the success of the Monitor, the Navy immediately ordered 6 more just like it, which became known generically as Monitors after the name of the first ship. So the Union began building dozens of Monitors by the end of the war. Some of them looked just like the original. Some had 2 turrets. They even tried some with 3 turrets. These were not always successful. They built a large Monitor fleet to help carry out the blockade. These Monitors were limited in their usefulness by their poor seagoing capabilities, just as the Monitor itself sank at sea. But they were not useless. They were very helpful ships. In 1863, there was a plan. There was a plan to attack Charleston, South Carolina, the South's, in some ways, the South's most important city, with a fleet of Union Monitors. The idea was that these Monitors would sail into the harbor, which was guarded by Fort Sumter, now in Confederate hands, and simply sail up to the city and begin bombarding it. There were many in the North who thought Monitors were invincible, having fought successfully against the Merrimac. And without recognizing the limitations on Monitors, the orders went through to send this Monitor fleet into Charleston Harbor by itself with no protection. The result was a fiasco. In April 1863, this Monitor fleet sailed in. The Confederate batteries that ringed the harbor and occupied Fort Sumter caused great damage on many of them, caused them to retreat without doing any significant harm. So the Union Monitor fleet there was not successful.
One question I forgot to ask during the battle.
Sure.
Where did it take place?
The battle between the Monitor and the Merrimac was in what's called Hampton Roads, Virginia, which is at the end of the Chesapeake Bay, where the James River empties into the Chesapeake. It's a very strategic location. From this spot, you can go up the James towards Richmond. You can go up the other side of the Virginia Peninsula, up the York River. You can go up the bay and up the Potomac River. So it's a critical point. Fort Monroe was held, it's at the tip of the Virginia Peninsula. That was held by the Union. That protrudes down from the top on our map. On the southern side was Norfolk and Newport News. This was the Virginia, the Confederate Virginia side. So this was a critical station for the Union blockade. And had the South won the battle here at the foot of the Chesapeake Bay, they would have broken the blockade in that part of the country. And they would have posed grave danger to the Union Army on the Virginia Peninsula, which depended on getting its supplies by sea. So it was a very strategic point.
Exactly what were they blockading?
Well, the idea of the Union blockade was to blockade the entire South, starting from Virginia down along the coast, the Carolinas, Florida, into the Gulf, all the way to Texas. If the Union blockade were effective, then nothing could go in or out of the South. The South could not get any new weapons. I mentioned they don't have, there were no iron rolling facilities. So if the South wanted new railroad iron, new cannon, new anything made of iron, they had to buy it from Britain. With the blockade in place, they can't get any of these things. So the South is forced to rely only on what it has. And what it has is cotton. The South imagined that its vast cotton supplies, its ability to supply the world with cotton, would force the rest of the world to side with the South when the war began, that Britain and France would demand that the Union recognize the South's independence so that cotton could once again be shipped overseas and continue to fuel the economies of these European countries. So the South wanted to send its cotton out, which it could sell as a valuable commodity, and bring in weapons and medicine and other things it couldn't make at home. With the blockade in place, none of these things can happen.
On the issue of succession, have Constitution scholars ever settled the issue whether or not they can?
No, Union soldiers settled the issue. When Jeff Davis was sent in flight from Richmond, the constitutional point became moot. The secession is not legal, and those who oppose it were defeated at a cost of 600,000 casualties, or those who supported it, rather. It's not. It was settled at Vicksburg and Gettysburg and many other places. There are those who will still attempt to dredge up constitutional arguments for and against it, but again, the point is moot. The government has spoken that those who try it will be suppressed.
How about talking a little bit about Jefferson Davis?
Well, perhaps I'm prejudiced working at the Lincoln Museum rather than the Davis Museum. But Davis was, tying into the Monitor and the Merrimac, Davis did not have as much of a hand in naval affairs as he did in military affairs. Davis was a West Pointer, a veteran of the Mexican War, imagined himself much more of a military leader than, say, Abraham Lincoln, and took some interest in the construction of ironclads. But his focus on these details did not make up for his lack of charisma, his lack of political magnetism, his inability to articulate his vision, all the things that Lincoln did that pulled the North together behind him.
So who was responsible for the design of the Merrimac?
That I don't recall the name of the naval architect who built the Merrimac. All the southern ironclads were improvised, certainly, again taking these existing hulls and building metal superstructures on them. But there was no Confederate shipbuilding industry, no southern shipbuilding industry to speak of. Okay. So they did not have naval architects in plenty. They did not have people to do this. They achieved wonders with the limited resources they had, though.
And that says a lot with the Merrimac. Up until Merrimac came along, ironclads were considered a joke and never worked.
Well, there was much skepticism as to whether they would work. The obvious question was, doesn't an iron ship sink? This was assumed by a lot of people. Ironclads were not expected to work by a lot of people, and some of them didn't. The British Navy, after the Civil War, built an ironclad vessel called the Hampton, which was designed like a frigate, but had the traditional look of a tall ship, full rigging, full masts and sails, a lot of iron protection, a lot of guns, very heavy, and it turned out to be very top-heavy, and the captain capsized, killing most of its crew on one of its early voyages, because the stability of ironclads was not fully understood yet, how to build a ship that would not sink or tip over or founder as the Monitor had done.
So when did, at what point did the Navy fully perfect the invention of a ship with a turret?
The turreted ships continued in use to the present day, of course. So modern ships still have cannon carried in turrets that spin around. The Monitor's turret was basically a sound design. There was some evolution over the rest of the 19th century between the guns carried in turrets and guns carried in what were called barbettes. Eventually, the barbettes were covered over with iron and became indistinguishable from turrets. It's a very technical point. Without going into detail, from the age of the Monitor on, turrets continued to be in use.
Oh, one point that's been brought up. When did submarines start coming into use?
Well, during the Civil War, in fact. There was a very primitive submarine used in the American Revolution, a one-man vessel called the Turtle, piloted by a man invented and sailed by David Bushnell. It was sort of a big keg, a wooden barrel, basically, in which the inventor sat and propelled it with by turning cranks that turned underwater propellers, and it was designed to go underneath a British ship, drill a hole into it, attach a bomb to it, and then float away. It was impractical. It didn't work. It was a descendant of a relative of Bushnell who helped get the Monitor through Congress, who was a politician, so there was a connection there. The Monitor itself, in a way, has many of the characteristics of a submarine. Its deck, you know, is this flat surface, really down to the surface of the water, so the crew lived underwater. There were no above water spaces other than the turret on the Monitor. So there were no windows, of course. There was no portholes. The crew got fresh air through a blower system. The crew had to dispose of waste through a double closing tube system that they use on modern submarines even today, because the whole thing was below the water level. You couldn't just open a seacock and let water come in when you wanted to throw something overboard. So the Monitor, in a fashion, was half of a submarine. Later in the war, the Confederates used the first effective submarine in battle. This was a ship called the Hunley, named for its inventor, a man named Hunley. He invented a cigar-shaped metal tube propelled by a crew of 8 or 9 men who turned a long crank that operated the propeller at the far end. And the Hunley, in its trial run, sank with all hands. The Confederates raised it, drained it, fixed it up, and Hunley made some changes to it and sent it back out with another crew, and it sank with all hands. So the Confederates raised the Hunley again, drained it, made some improvements, sent it out again. This time they sent the inventor, Hunley, on the ship. They were not taking any chances the third time. It sailed out into, I believe this was in Charleston Harbor, in fact, against a Federal blockading squadron, and attacked a Union ship, the USS Housatonic, using a spar torpedo, which is basically a bomb at the end of a long stick. A crude weapon, the bomb went off, did blow a hole in the Housatonic and sink it, but the concussion sank the Hunley as well, with all hands. And that was the end of submarines in the Civil War. It was an interesting experiment. It did lead to the first successful sinking of an enemy vessel by a submarine in war, but it was costly. It did not ultimately prove successful. You didn't see practical submarines until the First World War, 50 years later.
Oh, yeah, the U-boats.
That's right, the German U-boats, and their British and French and Russian variations. But the German U-boats became prominent after 1914.
Since we still got about 10 minutes left, I thought you might like to talk a little bit about the museum itself.
Sure. The Lincoln Museum, as I mentioned, has been here many years. It is it is the world's largest museum dedicated to the life and times of Abraham Lincoln. In our main exhibit, Abraham Lincoln and the American Experiment, it tells the story of how Lincoln led the United States through its most critical era. Until the Civil War, the United States was very much seen as an experiment. No other nation had tried democracy on such a large scale, and there are many who doubt, in Europe especially, who doubted that such a government could ever succeed. The idea that ordinary citizens were qualified to vote and to choose their leaders rather than have a hereditary government like every other country had seemed wild and impractical. And there were many in America who doubted this could succeed. With the outbreak of the Civil War, this seemed to confirm to Europeans their suspicions that government by the people was not practical. Sooner or later, the people would disagree. They'd come to blows. One part would secede from another, and then another would secede from that, and soon you'd have anarchy. and you'd eventually need what every European country knew you needed, which was a king and an aristocracy to govern things. Well, Lincoln was one of those who believed that the American experiment could succeed, that the Founding Fathers had the right idea. And what we try to tell in our exhibit, Abraham Lincoln and the American Experiment, is how he grew up as a product of that experiment, how he rose from humble beginnings to become America's greatest national leader, and how in due time he was able to preserve the American experiment by winning the Civil War, and how he was even able to take the experiment a step further by ending the scourge of slavery, which of course excluded 10% of the populace from participating in the experiment in the first place.
Was communication on ships available during the Civil War, or was it simply spoken?
Communication was difficult in any fashion during the Civil War era. You had telegraph for rapid communication, but that's not available at sea, of course. Ships could communicate with signals, with flags, but that was fairly limited. For the most part, if you wanted to get a message to a ship, you had to send someone out in a smaller, faster ship to catch up and let them know. So it was difficult to communicate with a ship at sea. It was really impossible if the ship was out on the open sea. Even within these vessels, communication was difficult. The Monitor in particular had a problem with this because it had that pilot house on the deck in front of the turret where the captain was standing, and the executive officer standing inside the turret commanding the fire of the guns. They couldn't talk to each other at all. There was a speaking tube that linked them, but it broke as soon as the guns started firing. So there was no communication within the Monitor other than sending a sailor carrying a message, verbal or written message, down below decks through the belly of the ship, then back up into the pilot house or the turret to relay instructions. So communication was very difficult.
Do you know when the Monitor was actually found?
It was found, I think, in 1973. The wreck of the Monitor is a national park, I believe, an underwater park. It's in off South Carolina, and there is now a movement underway to see if the Monitor can be raised. As I said, it's a designated underwater park so that people are not free to go and take things from it. It's public property. Taxpayers bought it, so individuals can't just go and steal bits of the Monitor for souvenirs. But no one can see it either unless you're a diver. So there's talk of raising it. This would be a very difficult operation to raise the Monitor. The water is deep enough, certainly, and it's been there long enough that most of the wood parts have rotted away. It might be safe to raise the turret, possibly. They may be able to get other parts of it up. If they did, we would learn a lot about the material, the construction, the material history of the Monitor. It would be very interesting. There was a Monitor, or not a Monitor, but an Ironclad ship that from the Mississippi River that was raised not too long ago, the USS Cairo. This was an Ironclad ship, not on the design of the Monitor, but looking a little bit more like the Merrimac, a turret or a case-mated ship with a stern wheel, a paddle wheel, not a propeller. The Cairo was raised with great difficulty and has been partially restored and is on display at the Vicksburg battlefield in Mississippi. If you ever have a chance to go to Vicksburg, it's a site you don't want to miss. The Cairo, restored by the Park Service, has many of the original guns, many of the original pieces, and where they could not find or could not salvage the original, they have built a skeleton of modern timber to show what the outline of the ship would look like. It's quite an experience to see what's left of this Ironclad. So if they could raise a Monitor, that would be quite an achievement. It would be worth traveling to see.
Also, something that has been thought up, what became of the careers of the captain?
Warden, the Union captain who was wounded in the battle, did not, I don't know what happened after he returned to action. He did not captain the Monitor after that. And something interesting happened to Jones, the Confederate captain, but I don't recall what that is either. After his ship was blown up, it seems to me he did something else for the Confederacy, but I would go back to our massive library at the Lincoln Museum and research that and find out the answer.
Now, for those who like to visit the museum, how much is admission and what are your hours?
The museum is open Tuesday through Sunday. Tuesday through Saturday we're open 10 to 5, Sunday 1 to 5, and admission is $2.99 for adults, $1.99 for senior citizens or children, or for group admission. If you pay your $3 for your $2.99 admission, you get change in the form of a Lincoln penny with a little souvenir card that tells the history of this coin, which was the first American coin to have a president's face on it.
So now, with the museum, is it a guided tour or do you go through yourself? Or?
It's designed to be self-guided. You can come over any time, walk through at your own pace. Visitors spend anywhere from an hour, hour and a half, up to 3-4 hours. There's more than most people can see in one visit, so frequently they'll take a look through and then they'll come back again and see what else there is. If you come with a group, you make a reservation in advance and we'll supply a docent who will give you a guided tour. But really, we encourage visitors to come with their own ideas, their own questions. It's not the kind of tour where you're led around and shown what to look at. We really like the opportunity that the exhibit provides for visitors to formulate their own ideas, their own questions, and explore at their own pace.
What's your favorite part of the museum?
Well, I like a lot of parts of it. The gallery in Abraham Lincoln and the American Experiment that tells the story of the Civil War is perhaps the one that I find myself drawn to the most. It features a timeline with artifacts and documents giving a general history of the war and Lincoln's participation in it. But it also has reproduction Civil War equipment, a musket, a soldier's pack, a haversack, and so on. Reproductions that the public can touch. Children can get a sense of what the weight of a backpack was or the texture of a rifle's musket, a rifle's stock. There's another portion of the same gallery where you can sit in a chair as though you were at Lincoln's desk and experience his daily routine, where he would have visitors come and see him for hours at a time and answer their questions. And there's a bank of computer programs, a set of 5 computer programs that were written for the museum that give you a chance to explore other aspects of Lincoln and the Civil War. So that gallery is perhaps my favorite. But there's a lot, and different people like different aspects of it.
How was the Civil War military different from the modern military as far as how it was set up?
Well, the military has changed a great deal, of course, since the Civil War. One way in that it's similar is that all the soldiers then, as now, are volunteers. The United States did not have a draft before the Civil War, and other than the peacetime draft in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, America has had a tradition of volunteer soldiers. So the soldiers in the Civil War were all volunteers, as they are today. One of the main differences is that Civil War soldiers had no training to speak of. They were trained by volunteer officers who knew no more about war than they did. So they went off and learned by doing. They went onto the battlefields and shot at the enemy and got shot, and that was their training. In that sense, it was very different from today's military. It was not a technological war, although you had things like the Monitor and the Merrimac, these new inventions. For the most part, the equipment was basic: a musket, a backpack, some cartridges. High-tech was not an element to the war, so it was very different in that regard.
Seeing we're going to be signing off a few minutes, do you have any last words you'd like to give?
Well, I hope people will get a chance to come down and see us at the Lincoln Museum. We have, in addition to the exhibit itself, a research library. If people want to learn more about the Monitor and the Merrimac or about Abraham Lincoln, I would encourage them to come to the Allen County Public Library. But also, if you have a detailed research question, call the Lincoln Museum and make an appointment to do research there. That's certainly available. IPFW offers a course in the Civil War that will be offered this fall, that will be taught at the Lincoln Museum. And if you're interested in learning about the war in excruciating detail, I'd encourage you to take that course. there's a lot of interest in the war today in American history generally, and I think it's a good thing. I think it shows that people have an enduring interest and understanding in the American experiment.
Okay, well, thanks a lot for coming.
Thank you for having me.
The show is on the first Thursday of every month at 10 a.m. and I look forward to you watching my next show. I thank you for your time and have a good day.